All right, so the mic is fine?
Run.
No? All right, I think we're all set. Hi, everyone. My name is Petar Tsankov. I'm going to talk to you about functional correctness of smart contracts and how to certify this. So we have already seen several talks related to finding exploits and detecting generic vulnerabilities in smart contracts. Here, I want to explain what's the difference between looking for generic vulnerabilities versus certifying custom functional correctness of smart contracts. Also, we have seen techniques based on static analysis, symbolic execution, so we're going to clarify what the guarantees of these are and in terms of the guarantees provided to end users. So the team working on the things that I will be talking about, on the left you see the research team. We're based at ETH Zurich, and we are focused on interdisciplinary research where we combine symbolic reasoning techniques from program analysis as well as data-driven techniques from machine learning to build useful security systems for different domains such as blockchain security, but also some other domains. And then on the right, you see the chain security team, which is a spin-off from the ICE Center. So there we focus exactly on blockchain security and bringing all these products and tools to the end user. All right, so I like to make this comparison here because there's actually something that comes in common when you think about smart contracts, airplanes, spacecrafts, and so on. So all these pieces are things that really have a safety critical piece of software that must not fail once you go and deploy this thing, all right? And however, there's a very important difference when we think about what steps we do to make sure that no bugs occur after deployment. So namely, if you look at how Boeing and NASA are deploying their software, before you deploy, for example, some controller on an airplane, you would formally verify and certify that this controller is working correctly once you deploy it on the airplane. The problem is that only a handful of projects have so far actually have been formally verified for when we think about traditional smart contracts. And this is a challenge, so because the vast majority of the smart contracts were basically using, most people are using best effort techniques to ensure that no bugs would occur once you deploy on the blockchain. So that's clearly is a challenge, and the consequences can not be surprising, that there will be a lot of embarrassing hacks and problems that will get missed out unless you do a proper development and security auditing process before, to make sure that all bugs are caught before deployment. So our mission at Chain Security is to change this. So we want to bring formal security guarantees for smart contracts and blockchain projects. So essentially, we want to take all the well-established traditional methods that we know that are capable and work very well for certifying safety-critical software, such as those deployed, used by NASA, Boeing, and so forth, and use those techniques to provide high-end guarantees also for projects that are building on smart contracts. So more technically, what this means is that we are doing some mathematical modeling to capture all possible behaviors of a smart contract. So this allows us then to prove that the contract would behave correctly with respect to formally defined specification of that contract. And while something to mention here is that formal verification is not something new in the space of contracts, so there have been few projects that have been formally verified, but the challenge is that the current techniques that are being used to formally verify a contract they really require a lot of manual expertise, so they're very time-consuming, and that's why most projects are not going this way, because it's a really expensive process to go through. And the way we want to change this is by building a lot of automation, which can reduce this cost of doing formal verification for contracts by at least one order of magnitude. And this way you could, let everybody benefit from this technology. That's the goal. All right, so to solve this, we have built a formal verifier for Ethereum contracts. And this verifier is capable to certify custom functional specifications. So I'm going to explain what this means now. But before giving you more detail on how you use such a system and how it works and why is it challenging to build it, I want to go a bit more into detail to explain why is it hard to certify such custom specifications for a smart contract. And again, something I want to open a note here is that I'm not talking about finding generic vulnerabilities like reentrancy, transaction reordering, buffer overflows. So these are basically known things that are bad and you have to check before you deploy. But here I'm talking about checking whether the contract correctly implements the exact business logic that the developer has in mind, okay? So I'm going to give you an example of what this process looks like. So to certify functional correctness, you start, well, with a smart contract. So you would have, for example, you would have a crowd sale smart contract, and let's say we have an escrow smart contract that is supposed to keep all the funds that are being invested by the users. Then the next step is that there will be a bunch of different requirements that we would have to certify that are correctly implemented by the smart contracts. So just to give you some examples, for example, we want to make sure that investors cannot claim refunds after the goal of the crowd sale is reached. So if the crowd sale is successful, no refunds should take place, okay? Another example is we would want to ensure that the sum of all the deposits that are stored in this escrow contract always equals the balance of the escrow contract. So intuitively, this means that the escrow actually keeps the funds that are being invested by the users during the crowd sale. And again, these are not generic properties. These are specific to the particular use case and smart contract you're building. Right. Next, to certify these requirements, so they're roughly speaking, this is split in two steps. So the first step is to formalize what these high-level English requirements mean at the level of the code. So that means that we would take such an informal requirement, and then we would formally write it in the form of a formal property. So you don't have to worry about how you specify these properties. This is the actual syntax that we used in the Verex formal verifier. But the key point is that you precisely define at the level of the contract what does it mean, whether in a given state a property holds or not. Okay? So that's step one. Once we resolve this, then the next challenge is to actually check that this property holds for all possible states that your contract can reach. And just thinking about this problem, you would have to go through the following process. So you would first look at the initial state, which is the state your contracts are in after deployment, after initially deploying your contracts. And then once you deploy, then users can start sending transactions to that contract. And then there are many different transactions that they can send. So each of those transactions, it would change the state of your contract to another state. So you would have to consider also whether the property also holds in these new states that your contract can reach. And it doesn't stop here because a second user will send a transaction, then a third user will send a transaction. And overall, there will be unbounded sequence of transactions that your contract would run. And the fundamental challenge is the following. So first, there are infeasibly many transactions for us to brute force, so we cannot enumerate all the transactions and run them and see if a property gets violated. And the second challenge is that we don't really have a bound on the number of transactions that your contract would receive once you deploy it. So this is really the fundamental challenge that we would have to solve. And well, it's challenging, so there are many different methods and techniques that can be used to discover violations or to prove that the contract works correctly. So I'm going to now give a slight overview on what these are. So manual review is not a surprise. That's actually what most projects are currently doing. Manual review involves checking, reading, having an expert read through the code and check if there could be a sequence of transactions that would result in breaking a particular property of your smart contract. And the downsides of this they're also well known because you have to rely on the expertise of the person who is checking. It's time consuming, and especially if you think about functional requirements, these are, if you think in the context of a very large project, it can be quite difficult for a person to grasp really the edge cases of such projects. So to do better, the next level would be to employ some form of automated testing, and we have seen several techniques here today about this. Some of you have probably heard about techniques such as fuzzing or symbolic execution, so let me actually show you what guarantees these would provide if you apply them to your projects. So let's look at fuzzing. Fuzzing will do the following. It would start from the initial state, And then essentially the fuzzer would generate a bunch of random transactions. It would execute them on your contract. And then this would result in observing few additional states. And then these are the blue checked boxes here that you see on the slide. However, all these red boxes are the things that are all these states that you would not see because your fuzzer did not generate a sequence of transactions to get there. And there could be states that are pretty tricky to reach in practice. So there would be such red boxes if you apply any kind of fuzzing techniques. And so these are basically the blind spots that you would see if you want to, where bugs could remain unless you cover those states. And there have been many, many tools that have been deployed that employ this kind of technique. It's a very well-established technique for software correctness in general. Then we also looked about how you apply symbolic execution to find bugs. Symbolic execution provides a different guarantee. It's not like fuzzing. And here's the difference. Well, symbolic execution is very good at handling the breadth of many different transactions. So what you could do is you could encode all the possible transactions that you could run in a given depth. And then this could give you a guarantee that, for example, once I deploy the initial state, for whatever sequence of 3 transactions you send to the contract, you would not see any violations of the property. So this is something you can guarantee with symbolic execution. What you cannot guarantee is that if you have an arbitrary large sequence of transactions, that you would not have vulnerabilities there. And this is simply because if you unroll this large number of transactions, the constraints that we just saw in the previous talk, they would get so complicated that no SMT solver would help you in solving those. So this is the fundamental challenge and limitation of these kind of techniques. And again, there has been many, many different tools that have been deployed, including the one we saw in the previous talk, that employs this kind of technique. And the goal is that it is useful because you could still find interesting exploits and vulnerabilities in the first, basically which are few transactions long. All right, so these are, I classify all manual review and automated testing. So these are bug finding techniques that they do not guarantee that you don't have issues, but they are useful to find issues. Formal verification is kind of a switch because this is the point where you actually can get a guarantee that your contract would work correctly for the lifetime of the contract, all right? So the goal here is that you would actually compute some representation of all the possible states your contract can reach and certify that all the properties that you have in mind, all the requirements, would hold for the lifetime of the smart contract. So that's what we're targeting. So this is what Verix does, and now I'm going to explain to you, this is great, but it's not easy to build such a system. So let me tell you what are kind of the key insights that we had when building this system, and also what is our experience in adopting such a formal verification approach when we check, when we audit smart contracts. All right, so at the boundary level, so this is how you use such a system. So we start with the smart contracts, the code of those contracts. Then we have some very high-level requirements that you would want to certify. And again, this is not a generic vulnerability. This is a custom requirement defined for the particular use case of this contract. Then, as a first step, and this is a manual step where somebody has to, either a developer or an auditor, would have to formally write this property in a language. I'll give a little bit more information about what this language is and what its capabilities are. But the point is that we can formalize the requirements. Then the second step is automated, so you can provide the code of the contract together with the formal property to the formal verifier, and then this verifier would either tell you that the property holds, and the guarantee that you get here is that once you deploy for any sequence of transactions, you would never violate this requirement. Or it may tell you that the property may not hold, and in addition, it can output some abstract trace of how you may actually violate the property. For example, it can output some sequence of transactions that if you run them with some particular values, you could reach a violation for a specific requirement. So that's at a very high level how you would use such a system. So again, the formalization of the property would be manual. This is something auditors would do. And the checking part, which is the difficult part, this is delegated to this verifier, which can give you this guarantee that the property holds. All right, so I mentioned that we would have to formalize these requirements. And something that was very important for us is to come up with something that's a language, specification language that is easy to use by auditors and developers. And here I have some examples of common properties that come up when you audit or verify smart contracts. So some examples are, well, very often you want to check the access control, whether access control is implemented correctly. For example, that certain functions like deposits are only called by an owner. These are things you may express in this language. Very often you also want to check very specific state-based properties. For example, after a certain time, so in this example, 1 week after the refund time has started, then no refunds can be made, all right? So you can formulate such things. You could, very often contracts have non-trivial state machines. So if you think of a crowd sale, you would have, for example, pre-sale, main sale, and then you would either lock into a successful phase or a refunds phase. So here, for example, you may formulate that the refund and the finalized phases are kind of disjoint. So if you reach refund state, you would never be able to, in the future, reach a finalized state, and vice versa. So basically, very often you want to check that this state machine is correctly implemented in the contract. Very often also we encounter invariants over aggregates like mappings and arrays, because in Solidity, for example, you don't have a way to iterate over the keys of a mapping, so often you have auxiliary fields like total supply to capture the sum of the balances in the contract. So you can also verify that these invariants hold. And if you think of large projects, you also very often have invariants over multiple contracts, so not only over a single one. These are also things that very commonly pop up. So the foundation of this language, it's an extension over Solidity with some quantifiers, but it has a very solid formal foundation. So this is based on linear temporal logic, which has been studied in decades, we very well know what are the complexities and expressiveness of these techniques. The second challenge that we had to address is basically how do you deal with this unbounded state space of the smart contracts. And here we employ two main ideas. The first one is to leverage symbolic execution to precisely reason about how individual transactions work. So this you can do because it is scalable enough to reason about depth one, meaning a single transaction. And then the second idea we combine is to leverage program abstraction to bound the size of the state space. So this is something that would allow us to make this task of verification computationally feasible. So this is definitely not something that can be explained here in 5 minutes, but feel free to ask me afterwards if you're curious how you can combine these two techniques. And there are many, many other challenges that you have to, if you want to build a sound symbolic verifier, there are many subtleties that are specific to Solidity and Ethereum. For example, hash-based allocations, you have to reason about gas mechanics. If you want to verify, you have to, all these features that are specific, you have to handle them in a sound way if you want to have, at the end, a soundness proof that your formal verifier can guarantee the property. So I have listed some of the common pitfalls that we have observed in existing symbolic execution engines. So they typically, there would be some variations of those where that would not be handled fully soundly, so to speak. All right, and in terms of impact, so we have been, what the system achieves is really fast and scalable formal verification for contracts. We have done a number of case studies on the research side as well as with concrete clients. And we see several important benefits in this space. Several important benefits that you get if you adopt such a verification approach. The main one that I would say is the mentality switch, that we're not longer talking about bug finding and best efforts. We're actually talking about, I certify that this works. And this is something you can put in, say, an audit report and give a guarantee to the end users. And that's useful because ultimately the end user wants to see what does this contract do, and this is what you want to put in the audit. And other benefits are more practically useful because, for example, very often contracts implement common functionality. So you could, for example, define a library of different specifications for tokens and crowd sales, and then reuse those across different audits of similar contracts. Recertification is also cheap because once you have formalized the properties, if some of them were violated because there was a bug, once the code fix comes from a client, you could rerun the system and check if this fix actually addressed the particular problem that was found by the verifier. All right, so How do you get access to this? Well, we're going to release a demo of the system that you can play with, including like play with the specification language to see what the capabilities are. We're going to upload this in the next few days at verex.ch. For now, you can go there and put your email, and we'll notify you when we upload the full demo. And if you're interested to use this as a service, for example, to integrate it within your development process or protocol, just send us an email and we can chat. So I have maybe 1-2 more minutes. I'm going to make one more quick announcement, not related to formal verification. So yesterday, actually, we released the first framework for automated testing of Solidity compilers. And we're now looking for people to join us and help us further develop this framework. It has been, the development of this is fully funded by the Ethereum Foundation. So this system is basically capable to generate thousands of different semantically equivalent contracts, and then run them and check if the compiler messed up in one of those cases. So you can find more detail about, here I mentioned, so this system already found few bugs. Some of you maybe recognize some of those bugs, and those have been addressed in the latest version of the compiler. If you want to find out more, so this is where the code, it's publicly available, and we have the Discord channel where you can join and just talk to us and see if you want to contribute in some form. So with that, I conclude. I hope I convinced you that what certification of contract means, why is it important, and what are the different methods and guarantees you can get if you want to do this. And yeah, thank you a lot, and happy to take a few questions if there's time. Thank you.